The Social Security Administration has announced that beginning in November, offices will close to the public at 3 p.m. And beginning in January 2013, offices will close at noon on Wednesdays. And let me add to the question, the administrative costs of Social Security are paid for from the contributions of workers. Please discuss your views on the federal budget and sequestration, which has in it a big cut to the Social Security Administration.
Absolutely. So the Social Security proposal is, with respect to office hours, is just part of this bigger challenge. How do we deal with our budget? How do we deal with our budget in the short term and the long term? And so whether it's that, whether it's proposals to, no Saturday delivery of mail or closing rural post offices, or whether it's the proposals about the sequestration and cuts to defense, but also cuts to veterans job services or cuts to school lunch programs. All of these answers are basically tied to how do we deal with our federal budget. And my opponent, George Allen, and I have very, very different views about this. First, we have different records. And then we have different views about what to do going forward. Let's start with records. Every budget has got two sides to it. It's got the revenue side and the expense side. During the debate the other night, I went right at George, and George and I know each other well, and we get along fine. It's just that we have a lot of disagreement on policy issues, and he's as proud of his policy positions as I am of mine. He's very sincere about it. But I went right at him and said, look, when you were in the Senate, you broke both sides of the balance sheet. I mean, you started at a point where we were in the best budget shape we'd ever been in modern history. We actually had a budget surplus. And then you broke both sides of the balance sheet by dramatically slashing revenues and dramatically increasing spending. And I pointed out when George was in the Senate, the national debt went up $16,000 every second he served. And he tried to say, well, that's not so bad compared to what it is now. And I said, wow, I've never heard anybody say they're proud of what they did before if it was just increasing the debt by $16,000 a second. So George broke both sides of the balance sheet. I governed in a different way. I actually governed I governed in a very tough economy. And I had to make reductions. I didn't jack up spending. I'm the only governor in modern times that left with a state general fund budget smaller than the one I started with. I reduced spending and tried to do it in targeted ways. And if I thought we needed more revenues for something like transportation, I didn't hesitate to go to the legislature and say, we've got to do this to keep our economy strong. So I believe that budgeting is about, let's deal with both sides of the balance sheet. Here's the current budget challenge we have as a nation. We spend in the federal budget about $3.6 trillion. We take in about $2.3 trillion. So that $1.3 trillion is the problem. That's the gap. That's what we have to solve, and that gap adds to a national debt that is now nearly $16 trillion. So how do we propose to deal with that gap? Well, here's my opponent's strategy. Number one, make all the Bush tax cuts permanent, even on the wealthiest. Wait, hold on a second. I thought we were about reducing a gap. What you've just done if you do that is you dramatically widen the gap. So his first step in dealing with our deficit problem is to dramatically widen the gap by making the Bush tax cuts, which were supposed to be temporary, by making them permanent even for the wealthiest. Then his second step is now we close the gap, the bigger gap, by just taking out the meat axe and swing it at everything. So voucherize Medicare, reduce education, reduce infrastructure, reduce R&D. Because he has pledged he took a pledge of allegiance to Grover Norquist on the first day of his campaign in January of 2011, I will never raise any tax ever under any circumstance. And he has rejected even $1 of revenue for $10 of cuts. So he would close this much wider gap all through cuts, and that's going to mean earlier office closings and school lunch programs closed and veterans job programs closed and all kinds of cuts, including cuts to defense. He says, I won't make cuts to defense, but if you're trying to cut that big a gap all through cuts, you're not going to be able to leave your biggest line item. So I have a different strategy. I start with the same gap and I say the first thing is, let's just reach a compromise and let the Bush tax cuts expire and narrow the gap first by bringing in some more revenue. The compromise I put on the table is this. Democrats have said let the tax cuts expire over 250. And that position has been the Democratic position for some time. And the Senate passed that. That's the president's position. The Senate passed it this summer, knowing it would go nowhere in the House. The House and George Allen take the position, we need to make all the tax cuts permanent. We got to find a compromise. We have to find a compromise. Neither side is going to wake up tomorrow and say, you know what, we've been wrong and you're 100% right. It's just not going to happen. So for a year now, I've been proposing a compromise on the Bush tax cuts of let them expire over $500,000. There's no theology or magic to that number, but it's a number that is a compromise. And if you let that happen, you raise $500 billion in revenue over the next 10 years. So now we're starting to narrow our gap down. So we narrow the gap down that way. We narrow the gap down by taking tax subsidies away from the big oil companies. We give the big 5 oil companies $2.5 billion of tax subsidies every year. I think I'm right on this number. I think last year the big 5 made $137 billion in profit. We're paying a lot at the pump. We don't, and I want them to be profitable. Look, we're paying a lot at the pump. Why do we need to give them tax subsidies too? George Allen, in our debate at Fairfax a couple of weeks back, defended those subsidies. Oh no, it's really important that we do them. If we take them away, we're hurting the job creators. I don't think ExxonMobil is the job creator. And I don't think they're going to create less jobs with a tiny fraction of their profit being taken back because they're getting tax subsidies they don't need. So my strategy starts with narrowing the gap by actually narrowing it. Let's let the Bush tax cuts expire. Let's take back some tax subsidies. And now we get down to the place where we do have to find some cuts, and I know how to make them. I would probably balance the budget with about $2 or $3 of cuts for every dollar of revenue. George would make the gap a lot wider and then try to shrink that gap all through cuts. That would be devastating to our economy. It would be devastating to the Virginia economy especially, and it would hurt important priorities like Medicare and education and defense.